The Battle of Gettysburg was the largest battle of the American Civil War and one of the largest on North American soil. It involved around 85,000 men on the Union side and over 75,000 men on the Confederate side. So what does this have to do with cybersecurity? Stick around, find out. The American Civil War took place during one of America's darkest times. Occurring between July 1st and July 3rd of 1863, the Union Army was led by General George Meade and the Confederate Army led by Robert E. Lee. And the Union Army suffered around 23,000 casualties, while the Confederate Army suffered around 28,000 casualties. In specific today, we're going to be looking at a battle that took place on the very last day of the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3rd, led by Major General George Pickett and what would later become famously known as Pickett's Charge. Although Major General George Pickett would have this battle named after him, the battle commander actually was Lieutenant General James Longstreet, who was under the direct command of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee commanded his Confederate forces to line up on this final day of battle to attempt to take advantage of Union soldiers lying on Cemetery Ridge. This was a strategic position that General George Meade of the Union Army had over the Confederates, and it was at this exact moment that Robert E. Lee was hoping to end this battle. On the morning of July 3rd, Robert E. Lee gathered his men in order to plan out how they would take Cemetery Ridge. With his 15,000 troops compared to the Union Army's 6,500 along Cemetery Ridge, they certainly had a numbers advantage. The battle would end up being planned to start at 1 p.m. with a bombardment of artillery of about 150 artillery guns into Cemetery Ridge's hill line. Following this bombardment, the Confederate Army would then march over 1 mile of open field into the Union armies and overwhelm them and take the hill. There ended up being two extremely fatal flaws with this plan. The first was that the artillery bombardment ended up overshooting the Union Army. Between all the smoke of the artillery and the positioning of the Union Army, the Confederates ended up overshooting the Union Army, causing very little damage and very few casualties. The second fatal flaw that occurred following the artillery bombardment when the Confederates stepped out and started their 1 mile journey through an open field to the Union Army along Cemetery Ridge. Well, in the middle of this field was an old road called Emmitsburg Road, and on one side of this road was a rail fence to its west, and on its east a post and board fence. The Confederate Army would have to climb over both of these fences, which would cause them to stop and climb twice over during their charge to the Union Army. During this climb and during this crossing of an open field, the Union Army took advantage, continually causing massive casualties along this charge. So what was the result of this charge? The Confederate Army ended up losing well over 6,000 of its soldiers during that charge alone. In fact, Major General George Pickett ended up losing right around half of his total men within this charge, who would end up being killed, wounded, or captured. It was immediately following Pickett's charge that the Confederates fled Gettysburg, and the turn of the war had finally started for the Union Army. So what can we learn from this historical lesson? Positioning and leveraging matters. The Union Army was better positioned than the Confederates, and they ended up over-leveraging their hand even with a greater army in numbers. Businesses need to understand their cyber risks around them and position themselves accordingly before an attack happens. The Union Army was quick to realize the importance of Cemetery Ridge and took it early in the Battle of Gettysburg. In the same essence, businesses need to position themselves in a strategic way regarding their infrastructure and cybersecurity. Companies cannot afford to wait for an attack before they realize that they've been mispositioned. Start by connecting with your strategic IT partner and having this conversation to better position your business. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe.